So, in the world that we live in today, we are spoiled when it comes to choices for entertainment. We can choose to watch a great many of things. But just because there are a lot of things to watch doesn't mean that they're all enjoyable. There are some things that you just don't expect to be fun to watch. Things like, I don't know, C-SPAN, for example. And another thing that I never thought that I would enjoy watching was a TV show about chess. And if you're not sure what I'm talking about, I am talking about a show called The Queen's Gambit. I want to try something a little different today, aside from the little setup that I've got here. The other thing that I want to try is that for this video, I want to talk about something that has nothing to do with politics and nothing to do with Korea. I want to try branching out a little bit. Before starting to watch this show, I didn't quite know what I was getting myself into. I knew that there was a lot of hype around this show, but besides that, the only other things that I knew about it was that it was about chess and that Anya Taylor-Joy was starring in it, and the only other movie that I saw her in was The Witch. Now, this show has only 7 episodes in it, and each episode lasts about an hour, a little less. But these 7 hours that I spent on this show it was enthralling, really. Uh, Not only was I entertained during these 7 hours, I was also given a voice that I did not think that I could express by myself. And I'll get into that a little bit later. Let's get down into the plot of the show first. The Queen's Gambit is about the life of a young woman named Beth Harmon, and we get to see what her life was like from childhood to the point when the show ends. And as it turns out, Beth Harmon was orphaned when she was a young girl. And we get to see what her life was like when she entered the orphanage and as she grew up and how she got into the chess world. As it turns out, there's a lot of heavy themes in this show. Beth Harmon was not orphaned by accident. Beth Harmon's mother had committed suicide. And this weighs heavily on her because although a lot of people assume that she had no memory of what had happened, it turns out that she does remember everything, and she even remembers the very last words that her mother ever said to her. And the fact that her mother was a brilliant woman with a PhD in mathematics and that she committed suicide is something that weighs heavily on her because Beth also thinks that her mother was mentally unstable and that she might be mentally unstable as well. Now, I don't know much about psychiatry or how children were medicated or how people were medicated at all in the 1960s. And by the way, that's when the show takes place, in the 1960s. Now, in this show, the children in the orphanage are prescribed tranquilizers, and Beth Harmon gets addicted to these tranquilizers. Now, I don't know if it is genetics or if she's just naturally talented in this way, but like her mother, Beth Harmon is also extremely intelligent. She meets the orphanage's janitor who teaches her how to play chess. And reading the books that he's given her, she learns how to master this game. And in just a short little while, she's able to picture the entire chessboard and all the pieces and how they move. And she's able to defeat players who are much older than her, players who are in high school, players who are also chess masters. She begins to be able to dominate the show. And later on, she's interviewed by a reporter, and this is what she says about her feelings about chess.
It's an entire world of just 64 squares. I feel safe in it. I can control it. I can dominate it. And it's predictable. So if I get hurt, I only have myself to blame.
Now, that line is extremely telling because it's able to distill what her feelings are, not just about the game, but about life in general. And if this show was just about chess, I think it would have been quite dull. But in Beth Harmon, we get a character who has a lot of flaws. And due to the examinations of her flaws and how she overcomes them, this show is not just about chess, but it's also about personal responsibility and overcoming one's weaknesses to become one's best self. Now, as the show progresses, it is quite evident that Beth Harmon is a very lonely person. But as any introverted and lonely person will be able to tell you, this loneliness is something that traps her but is also her refuge at the same time. She desperately seeks to escape from her loneliness. She wants to be able to connect with her peers and her friends, or with anyone who might be willing to give her the time of day. But at the same time, her loneliness is also her refuge. She's not able to connect with just anyone. She has a hard time just talking to anyone about any other topic besides chess. And because she has such a difficult time connecting with others, she feels like a perpetual outsider. And so, as much as she wishes to escape from her loneliness, she also clings on to it. And because of this constant struggle with her loneliness, her longing to escape from it, but also her desperate desire to cling on to it, she eventually gets hooked on a whole lot of other things that is destructive. Now, The Queen's Gambit is not the only show that deals with the topic of addiction. Another show that deals with the topic quite well is Bojack Horseman. But anyway, back to The Queen's Gambit. When this show begins, even from the very first episode, we are told that Beth Harmon, even when she's just a young girl, is already addicted to these tranquilizers. And when it's discovered that she's addicted, the orphanage does all it can to force her from taking any of these tranquilizers again for a few years. But a few years later, when she's a teenager and she's been adopted, she discovers that her stepmother is prescribed these tranquilizers as well. And although it's been a few years since she's had any of these tranquilizer pills, she immediately gets back into the habit again. And that's something that any addict would be able to tell you is just so accurate. Once an addict, always an addict. Beth Harmon had not taken any of these pills for years, but even though it's been years, as soon as she sees these little green pills, she immediately finds a way to sneak some of them for herself. And this is an experience that a lot of addicts have already experienced on their own. And of course, her destructive habits don't end with these tranquilizers. Eventually, she also starts to smoke marijuana. And to be honest, I'm not sure why marijuana was made such a big deal in this show. Once you are addicted to tranquilizers, marijuana is probably nothing. Now, aside from the marijuana, the other thing that Anya Taylor-Joy's character gets addicted to is alcohol. And that's something that I can relate to. I'm a recovering alcoholic. And because I have been in the very same exact situations that her character is in, that's why I appreciated the acting in this show so much. It was easy to know when her character was drinking because she was celebrating. It was easy to tell when she was drinking because she was trying to escape from her feelings, or when she was punishing herself, or when she was angry. There are different reasons why people drink, and people act differently when they drink during those different moods. And she was able to act those scenes out in ways that were so easy to identify. And that could not have been easy. And the acting was just, well, it didn't feel like acting. Let me just put it that way. Now, the tranquilizers and the booze, they played different roles. The tranquilizers are there for just one purpose, to help her. Anya Taylor-Joy's character mistakenly believes that the pills help her to tap into a part of her intelligence that she normally does not have the ability to tap into when she's sober. Now, it turns out later on that her ability to tap into this part of her brain has always been within her reach, and that she didn't need the pills, but that comes later. As for the booze, well, as anyone who's ever drunk to excess will be able to tell you, alcohol has many different roles. By drinking alcohol, you're able to lower your inhibitions, you're able to be connected with other people and get closer to them. Back when I was still drinking heavily, even when I went to the bar alone, I would never feel lonely, because just a few drinks later, it didn't matter whether I was there alone or with friends, I would start talking to people like as though I've known them my entire lives. We'd share stories and we'd laugh, and it'd be a grand old time. And that's part of the reason why Beth Harmon starts to drink as well. But of course, that's not the only reason why Beth Harmon drinks. Later on, when she loses a match, she also starts drinking because that's the only way that she's able to numb her pain. And later on, it also to punish herself. When she feels that she's not worthy of love, when she feels that she's afraid that she might not be able to achieve her ambitions, when she hates herself the most, that's when she drinks, because alcohol is also a surefire way to ruin your life, especially when it's drunk to excess. And part of herself must know this because she just keeps on drinking. She pounds one drink down after another. There's a scene when she's trying to take out all of these empty bottles from her home, but she falls out because the bottles are too heavy. And yeah, I know how that feels too. Now, I mentioned Bojack Horseman in passing earlier. Now, because Bojack Horseman lasted so many seasons and was able to get into the depths of the destructiveness of addiction, by the time that show ends, while the show could not have ended in a better way, it wasn't really cathartic. By the time the show ended, I thought that it felt like a real show in the sense that I had just finished watching a real life story, even though it was just a cartoon about a horse. And that's because, unlike a TV show or a movie, addictions don't end the moment the credit starts to roll. You know that when the show ends, his character, Bojack Horseman, is still going to have to deal with his addiction for the rest of his life. And when the show ends the way that it does, I'm not going to spoil anything here, one can feel that he has only just begun his journey. But that's not the feeling that you get with the Queen's Gambit.
It gets easier.
Huh?
Every day it gets a little easier.
Yeah?
But you gotta do it every day. That's the hard part. But it does get easier.
Okay.
Now, throughout the Queen's Gambit, Beth Harmon feels lonely. And because of her loneliness, she gets into these romantic relationships that are not at all romantic. She just wants people to be around her so that she won't feel lonely. And that's another aspect of her loneliness and part of the reason why she gets addicted to all of these things. But by the time the show ends, she realizes that her life is not as lonely as she thought it was the whole time. Now, at the end of the show, Beth Harmon is in Moscow playing a game of chess against her most fiercest competitor. And she thinks that she's playing this game all on her own. But when the game is adjourned, she gets a phone call from her friends in America. And as it turns out, all of her friends were listening to the show on the radio and were strategizing and were trying to help her the whole time. She was never alone. And the show also goes out of its way to point out that she never needed tranquilizers to be able to visualize a chessboard. The show does this amazing thing where every time she took these tranquilizers, she was able to look up at the ceiling and was able to visualize a chessboard and all the pieces, and all these chess pieces would be moving in different ways, and she'd be able to strategize and picture how things would happen when she plays this game. And she always thought that she needed these pills to be able to reach into that. But toward the end of the show, when she's flushed all of her pills down the toilet, literally, she's still able to picture this chessboard on the ceiling. And so when this show ends, it feels triumphant. She's not alone, she has friends, and she doesn't need these pills. And because she doesn't need these pills to feel triumphant, she doesn't need the alcohol to punish herself. And so it feels like the show is saying that she has triumphed over her addictions, over her own weaknesses. And that's what is a little bit unrealistic about this show. Now, I'm not going to comment too much about the chess itself. I don't know a thing about chess. All I do know about the show is that it depicted addiction in a very realistic way throughout the show until the end. Now, as I said, I'm a recovering alcoholic, and this isn't the first time that I've been sober for a stretch of time, but this has been the longest time that I've been sober. And in this most recent attempt that I've taken to be sober, this person that I met online, who I've never met in real life, told me that there's a phrase that a lot of people who are trying to overcome their addiction to alcohol say to themselves. And the phrase is, I will not drink with you today. Now, this phrase is important because when a lot of people try to end their dependency on alcohol, they tend to tell themselves that they will never ever drink again. And when they say that, they immediately imagine the rest of their lives. Now, you could be 20 or 30 or 40 or 50, but no matter your age, when you think of the rest of your life, whatever that concept may be, the rest of your life seems like a very long time. And because that time that we imagine in our heads is so unimaginably long, immediately, the moment that we say that we are never going to drink for the rest of our lives, we set ourselves up for failure. Because it feels like such a long time, we just can't handle it. But by saying the phrase, I will not drink with you today, that helps because the rest of our lives seems like such a difficult thing to comprehend, to grasp, because it's such a long time. But today is something that I can control, to a certain extent anyway. I can choose not to drink today. And once today is done, and tomorrow comes and tomorrow's today, I can focus on today again. And so every day I say to myself, I will not drink today. And that's how I've been able to stay sober for the longest amount of time so far. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm going to be sober forever. Falling off the wagon is a thing that happens to the best of us. I could very well fall off the wagon again someday, though I'll try my very best not to. But back to the show, The Queen's Gambit, when the show ends and the final credits appear, it feels too triumphant. Whereas the rest of the show did an extremely good job with depicting addiction and just how destructive it is and how difficult it is to overcome, the very last the very last episode makes it seem like it was also very easy. That it's something that she doesn't really have to focus on again. And that was, I feel like that could have been handled a little bit better. And that's because addictions in real life is not as easy to overcome as the very last episode of this show seems to imply it is. It's not. Now, The Queen's Gambit did a really good job in dealing with the topic of addiction and loneliness. But it was so much more than that. After all, this show was about a young woman who rises in what's essentially a man's world. Chess, for the most part, has always been dominated by men. And the fact that this young woman starts to rise up in the ranks, starts to dominate each tournament that she's in, is also a lot of fertile ground to talk about sexism. And this show also does it quite well. At one point, Thomas Brody Sangster, who plays the character Benny, who is one of Anya Taylor-Joy's love interests, calls her a little girl, despite the fact that he's only a few years older than her. And I'm sorry, Thomas Brody Sangster is supposedly 30 years old. You cannot tell me that that man looks like 30 years old. He looks like he's still 15. Now, in these particular scenes, when people say that women just don't play chess or women are too emotional to be good at playing chess, these are obviously very overt expressions of sexism. But this show also deals with microaggressions quite well. There's scenes when another male player would tap his feet or when he would yawn when she's playing chess because they feel like they do not owe her any bit of respect simply because she's a woman. Now, obviously, I'm not a woman, and so the experiences of sexism that Anya Taylor-Joy's character goes through are not the same experiences that I've ever been through. And the ones that I were able to catch from the show were merely those that I was able to understand academically. They're not something that I felt viscerally. And so I'm sure that there are other scenes that I must have missed, but I'm sure that if we actually go through these scenes, scene by scene, and analyze them, there are a lot more scenes that show the subtleties of sexism that work and how the show just does a very good job of explaining the absolute maddening and insidious nature of sexism that exists that women have had to endure their entire lives. Now, earlier I said that the fact that this show ended in such a triumphant note was unrealistic when it comes to the ultimate depiction of addiction. But the fact that the show ended in such a triumphant note is also part of this show's strength. And that's because we all need to feel triumphant from time to time. Real life can be such a difficult thing to go through, isn't it? 2020 has been an extremely challenging year for so many people around the world, and there's no reason to believe that 2021 is going to be any better. Even if it's just from a TV show, we at least need to feel like there is a way to overcome things, a way to overcome things that might seem insurmountable. And believe me, addiction, if you're not addicted to anything, consider yourself lucky, but addiction can be such a deep, deep and dark pit to climb up from. And this show gives people a sense of hope. And while Bojack Horseman did a much better job of realistically portraying addiction and its destructiveness, occasionally we need a reason to be optimistic. And this show does that. And so, if you have not yet seen The Queen's Gambit, I highly recommend that you do. It's on Netflix. So please, give it a watch and tell your family about it. Tell your friends about it. It's a great show, and I guarantee you that you will not ever regret watching this show. Okay, that's the end of this video. If you liked it, don't forget to click on the like and subscribe button as well as the notification bell. I'm John Lay, and I'll see you all next time. Bye.